Hey, how's it going, Sido? I'm going to be talking about banks and how they have eliminated need for bank to hold any percentage of the money into reserve. It has been moved to zero. Most likely, most of you already know that, but just in case, there was change in the banking regulations or reserve requirements. All the time. Banks are often required to maintain a certain level of reserve, which are funds held in reserve to cover withdrawals and other financial obligations. These reserves requirements can change over time and be based on economic circumstances and governing policies. In other words, what I'm going to be talking about is it's something that's used to be called the gold standard. That means every dollar, a pound, or euro should be held in the reserve to cover it if needed. So that means there wouldn't be necessary printing press. So every money or every dollar or pound should reflect how much weight in gold your government would have in the reserve. So the government would not just print money if it can, or print tens and thousands of billions of dollars or pounds and euros just because they can. And over time, this policy has changed. Let's take a look at or go in more detail. Uh, it used to be that 100%. So for every dollar that government would have in its reserve, they used to have equal amount of money being printed. So every dollar was covered in gold in the reserve, and it was at the time it was 100% policy where 100% reverse requirement, historical pre-20th century. Days before 20th century reserve requirement, banks were often required to hold 100% of the deposits as reserves. This means that they had to keep an amount equal to all the money deposited with them on hand and couldn't lend it out for so it was equal 100% of how much money banks had to hold at one point. Most of the people know about it, but it was called the gold standard, and over time this standard has changed, where the money was printed and created out of thin air. A gold standard is a monetary system in which the value of the country's currency is directly tied to a specific quantity of gold. Under gold standard, the government or central bank guaranteed that it will exchange its currency for exact amount of gold at predetermined rate. In other words, the currency's value is linked to the value of the gold, and this linkage is supposed to provide stability to the currency and the broader economy. Some key characteristics when looking at the history of that would be convertibility. Under a gold standard, individuals and other countries could exchange their paper currency or banknotes for the equivalent amount of gold at a fixed exchange rate. This provides confidence in the currency's value. Fixed exchange rate, countries on the gold standard typically maintain fixed exchange rate with each other. This means that the exchange rate between two countries will remain constant as long as both countries adhere to the gold standard. Makes a lot of sense. It makes so much sense. Who gave gold value? I don't know, but for some reason, all the world agree that gold holds some value, and to reflect gold's value, every country would need to hold equal amount of gold in its reserves. Stability. Advocates of the gold standard argue that it provides price stability and prevent governments from printing excessive amount of money, which could lead to inflation. Constraints on monetary policy. One drawback of the gold standard is that it can limit the government's ability to respond to economic crisis. Because the money supply is tied to the amount of gold held, it can be challenging to expand the money supply during times of economic downturns. Historical significance. The gold standard was widely used in 19th century and early 20th century, particularly during the heyday of the British Empire. The Bretton Woods system, established after World War II, was modified gold standard where the US dollar was tied to gold and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. For those of you who following history, especially what's happening right now, there's a lot of changes where other currencies prefer to stay on their own instead of being pegged to anything. At least they're moving away from gold, they're moving away from dollar. Other currencies, that's what's currently happening. It's been happening for some time. It's not anything new. But perhaps worth covering. But other than that, yeah. So currencies, uh, at one or another point was pegged to something. So depending on the country, I don't know what's even true anymore, right? So many different currencies were pegged to different things, or have been tried to peg to different things depending on the country. Uh, which is, I have so many funny stories, but I don't know if those stories are true. Abandonment. Most countries abandoned the gold standard during the 20th century. The United States, for example, officially ended the convertibility of US dollar into gold in 1971, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. Modern relevance, while the gold standard is no longer in widespread use, discussions about returning to some form of gold-backed currency occasionally arises in economic and political circles. Even now, they're considering doing that, and some of the countries buying up a lot of different precious metals. Not necessarily. It's just because how much they actually need to, and once the country starts buying out, the price, supply and demand rises. So if they actually doing, those countries is actually doing that, nobody should discuss that. They should do hush hush kind of thing, just because of supply and demand, right? So more people buying up a lot of gold, price would increase. So not necessarily they would do that out in the front or in the daylight or whatever. Right? However, such policies are usually met with skepticism because of the limitations and complexities involved. Or they do that good old Kansas City trick where they would say, no, no, we cannot do that, and they would do it either way just because of supply and demand, but either way. For those of you who would like to learn more, I highly recommend you purchase this book. And this book, I'm focusing on fitness and where to begin your journey when it comes to working out, learning more about body that we all are stuck in, right? Making most of it, and how to begin working out, doing making most of your time in the gym, as well as perhaps things that you should focus on. Those things can be rest time, as well as your eating habits, addressing perhaps some of the issues there if you have any. Perhaps you doing just as well, just great, and perhaps looking to not necessarily reduce excess body fat, but perhaps becoming more active and increase your muscle mass so you can improve those areas as well. I'm talking about that as well a lot. You can find all the information in the book, in the description below, as well as top retailers has it. Uh, just to summarize, where we currently are, where most of the currencies at one point or another, if we were focused on US dollar, was back to gold. The standard was removed, and now slowly over time, dating back to 20th century approximately, The reserve requirements may have been reduced to around 50%. Banks were required to keep 50% of deposited funds as the reserves, allowing them to lend out the other 50%, right? Over time, it had moved from 50 to 10%, where a bank could hold, if you deposit an amount of money, a bank will be required to hold 10% and they could potentially lend the rest of the money, put that money into work to generate more money. Where now it was removed to zero, so banks don't need to hold anything in the reserve. It depends on the bank or and operations, but just so you're aware, within recent years, Federal Reserve has removed the standard. I believe it happened about 2 years ago, where it went all the way to zero. So banks don't need to hold anything anymore. They can lend potentially. There are some restrictions, perhaps, but not with regards to holding any money. But in particular, you focus on that now. They do not need to hold any money in order to lend any money. There might be other restrictions because most of the money is insured by the government, so governments might restrict lending. But overall, they're not restricting how much money banks need to hold in the reserve. Thanks for watching. See you next one.